What if the dimension of time was no different from the 3 dimensions of space we live in? What if you could travel to the past and to the future, the same way you can move right or left, up or down? Would you be able to change the past? And if you did, would it create a time paradox? What kind of time machine would you need to build anyway? This is What If, and here's what would happen if you could travel through time. How many times have you wished you could jump in a time machine and skip that boring meeting? Or choose a better comeback in that argument last week? Time travel sounds like some wild fantasy that only happens in sci-fi movies, but we're actually traveling in time every day. Albert Einstein found that time is not a constant, but is continually moving forward, and we're moving forward with it. According to Einstein, time is the 4th dimension. Together with 3-dimensional space, it's fused into a single 4-dimensional continuum, space-time. If you think of traveling in space, moving upwards is a bit of a challenge, unless we get on a plane, or at least take the stairs. So maybe we just haven't come up with a proper machine to travel in time yet. Theoretically, building a time machine is possible, but it wouldn't look like this, or like this. Rather, more like this. Because the secret to time travel isn't in some exotic form of matter, what you'd need is a spaceship that could travel almost as fast as light. Einstein's theory of relativity taught us that the faster we move through space, the slower we move in time. Let's assume you were in a spaceship, traveling at 99.9% the speed of light, to a potentially habitable exoplanet some 40 light years away. You find some primitive life forms and speed back to Earth to share your discovery. But when you finally make it back to Earth, you discover that all your colleagues are now very, very old. From your perspective, you'd only been gone for about 2 years. For people on Earth, you'd been gone for 80. This phenomenon is known as time dilation. It's not likely to happen to you though, because traveling at the speed of light isn't quite possible with the technology we have now. The fastest piloted vehicle we've ever created, Apollo 10, reached a speed of 11,000 meters per second. The speed needed for time travel is somewhere near 299 million meters per second. On top of that, accelerating at that speed would cause an enormous centrifugal force, a force that would rip you apart before you came anywhere close to light speed. But hey, we still have wormholes. Einstein predicted that these theoretical tunnels link 2 separate places and 2 different times, a shortcut to another universe and another time. The problem with wormholes is they're extremely tiny, just a billion trillion trillionths of a centimeter across. No human would be able to fit through. I can barely fit in my jeans from last year. If only we could capture a wormhole, we might be able to enlarge it. Imagine a giant tunnel above the Earth leading to another planet. And theoretically, if we put both ends of a wormhole in the same place, but in different times, we could step into a wormhole and come out in the distant past. But wormholes have their issues. They're very short-lived, and traveling into the past would create paradoxes, like the one in which you go back in time and convince your grandmother never to get married. Then your grandmother doesn't give birth to your dad, and he doesn't have you. But if you didn't exist, who went back in time to talk your grandmother out of marrying your grandfather? Time is linear. It only goes forward. For that reason, we can only travel into the future, not to the past. In fact, astronauts that spent about a year on the International Space Station are now living in the future compared to us. Even though it's just 13 milliseconds in the future, they're proof that traveling in time is possible. And maybe wormholes could open up a whole different world, where the laws of physics work in different ways, and traveling to the past is possible. Would you dare step into a time machine not knowing where it would take you? And if you had the choice, where would you go and when?
Okay, now that we know the ground rules of time travel, let's have some fun. First trip, 200 million years ago, when the theropods were still roaming and Pangea was still a thing. This is still a long time before humans appeared, so you might get kinda lonely. Not to mention there's a whole different lifestyle to get used to. Say goodbye to your toothbrush, hot showers, microwavable meals. You're gonna have to rely on your hunter-gatherer abilities before that term was even a thing. And not only that, but you're going to be competing for resources with actual dinosaurs. None of your human buddies will be there to help you. You're on your own, pal.
This is the world 200 million years ago. No cell phones, electricity, or even other humans. Would you be able to survive in this new world? Could you get yourself a pet dinosaur? Wait, dinosaurs are here? Okay, maybe this won't be so bad. This is What If, and here's what would happen if you were alive 200 million years ago. The world was pretty different during the late Triassic period. One of the most notable differences is this right here. This is Pangaea, a supercontinent containing different parts of today's world. There's Australia down south, North America in the northwest, and Eurasia in the east, all interconnected. It would take you a while, but in theory, you could walk from California to France. You won't see the Hollywood Walk of Fame or see the Eiffel Tower, as they don't exist yet. What would you see? The first thing you'd notice as you're traveling across Pangaea are all the dinosaurs running about. You won't have to worry about dinosaurs such as the Dilong that weigh only 11 kilograms. They won't pose much of a threat. But watch out for the Melanorosaurus, who has a height of 12 meters and would find you to be a tasty snack. Scientists say that the late Triassic period was the dawn of the first dinosaurs. Dinosaurs of all sizes would be everywhere. You'd also see some other crazy creatures you've never seen before, and some that may remind you of animals you see today. This species, known as the Drepanosaurus, with its reptile-like skin and arched back, might be one of the first versions of birds to ever exist. The Triassic period was an incredibly important 50 million years of evolution. A time with not a lot of competition between species, since just prior to this period, 70% of Earth's creatures were wiped out in a mass extinction event. Many of the animals at the time were able to thrive and grow without having to be constantly wary of other predators. The further you travel inland into Pangaea, you'll notice the massive weather changes. The outer edges of the supercontinent may be full of lush forests and green grass, but the further you go in, that begins to change. Scientists suspect that much of Pangaea was a dry, desert wasteland. That's because the land mass was so large that the interior wouldn't have received the cooling effects of the ocean. Speaking of which, the ocean, known as Panthalassa, surrounded all of Pangaea and covered 70% of Earth's surface. This ocean was extremely deadly. It could easily produce super hurricanes and monsoons, and due to its massive size, they could gain enough momentum to hit Pangaea with potentially fatal weather. Pangaea was just beginning to separate 200 million years ago. If you were able to stick around a few million more years for the Jurassic period, that's when you'd truly see dinosaurs thrive.
Nice! Great job, you made it out alive. As a reward, I'm gonna send you back to ancient Egypt. This time you won't have to worry about being lonely. By the way, did you know that Cleopatra was alive in a time closer to the invention of the iPhone than the time that the pyramids were built? Insane. Now, look, you might think we're advanced with our smart TVs and our AI chatbots, but the ancient Egyptians were way ahead of their time. Yeah, maybe they didn't have Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, but the mathematicians and architects of the time created things so amazing that we struggle to recreate them today. It's unclear what kind of machinery they might have used back then, but vases and utensils found in ancient Egypt were made with unbelievable accuracy and precision. We can't deny these were really intelligent people. Take a look.
Imagine a time of scientific and mathematical innovation, magic, and fertile land irrigated by the Great Nile River. Ancient Egypt was a successful and intelligent civilization that lasted for 3,000 years. What do you think your life would be like if you were an Egyptian during this time period? And let's pretend it's a good period. No droughts, locusts, plagues, or famine for you. What kind of food would you eat? How were women treated? And did slaves build the pyramids? This is What If, and here's what would happen if you lived in ancient Egypt.
Ancient Egyptians believed in strict social structures. Depending on the class or trade you were born into, your life would be vastly different. The hierarchical pyramid of social status and wealth was composed of slaves and servants, tenant farmers, specialists like sailors and soldiers, educational professionals, and finally, the elite. Who would you be? At the bottom of the social pyramid were slaves. They came from foreign lands but were not of a single race. And while they could negotiate their contracts, they were still bonded laborers and worked in exchange for food and shelter. At the very top of the pyramid was the ruler who reigned over everyone. There were 300 rulers throughout ancient Egypt's existence. While we call them pharaohs today, that wasn't their actual title in ancient Egypt. Rulers did not necessarily have to be men or Egyptian, but they were seen as divine liaisons between the gods and the people. Life would be drastically different depending on your gender. Like many ancient civilizations, Egypt had strict gender roles. But you still had the same legal rights. Women could own property and live alone if they chose to. However, marriage was seen as a social and economic necessity, no matter your gender. So, if you lived in ancient Egypt, you'd probably be married and have a brood of children. You would live in a house built of mud bricks with a stone oven and pits dug into the ground for food storage. If you were an elite family, then lucky you. As a nobleman or woman, you would be waited upon by your servants. After a breakfast of bread and fruit, the man of the house would take his chariot down to his estate on the banks of the Nile. After touring the grounds and maybe meeting with the estate overseer about the year's harvest, you might take a quick nap. Once you're rested, you would meet up with a friend to hunt wildfowl on your estate. At home, as a woman, you would spend the day supervising plans for a banquet. Before the banquet begins, you would adorn yourself with gold and semi-precious stones to further show your wealthy status. Now, you're ready to greet your guests as they arrive in chariots and litters, which were wheelless enclosures carried on the shoulders of servants. Nobleman or woman, you feast on geese, duck, fish, ox, and gazelle, followed by grapes, figs, dates, and melons. Once the party is over, you head to bed while your servants clean up. Life as a farmer is not nearly as grand. If you're a man, you spend the day working in the fields and tending to cattle or ducks. On tax day, you would pack up some of your harvest and bring it to the temple as payment for the land. If you're a woman, you spend the day grinding wheat, making bread, and raising children. For food, you mainly eat bread, beer, garlic, and, if you're fortunate, a little bit of meat. Maybe you're neither part of the elite or a farmer, but a pyramid builder. You wouldn't be a slave, but you would live a life of hard labor. You would be one of 10,000 devoted workers. Since it took 30 years to build one pyramid, you would probably work on the same monument for your entire life, which would be shorter than your fellow ancient Egyptians because of all that hard labor. At least you get to eat meat regularly and get an honorable burial once you die. No matter your status, you would worship several thousand gods, and for fun, you would play board games such as Mehen or Senet to pass some free time. Overall, the quality of your life would drastically depend on your ruler and the time period. There were 3 periods of prosperity
and 2 periods of instability during this civilization.
Okay, this might sound crazy, but I think I would have loved living in Europe in the Middle Ages. People mainly ate with their hands, and the outfits were super cool and funky back then. Well, if you were an elite, that is. For everyone else, the Middle Ages were kind of awful, to say the least. But at least it was a more simple time. All your friends probably lived in your neighborhood, and sword fighting was all the rage. Now everyone fights on their phones. Big whoop. There's even a rumor that water back then was so dirty that they relied on beer for hydration. Yeah, we're not sure if that's true, but let's go back and see what else they did.
Hast thou aye been curious about medieval life? Wouldst thou travel back in time if thou couldst? Doth thou regard thou wouldst enjoy it? How long wouldst thou last? This is What If, and hither's what would befall you if thou lived during the Middle Ages. Hear ye, hear ye! The Middle Ages sucked. After 200 years of peace and prosperity under Pax Romana, the Roman Empire fell into crisis and decline. Thus began the Middle Ages, more commonly known as the Dark Ages, beginning towards the end of the 5th century and lasting until the start of the Renaissance in the 14th century. This was a time when, unless you were a knight, nobleman, or the king himself, life was brutal and scary. Hygiene was poor, money was scarce, diseases were rampant, and punishment was cruel. Beds were not soft, and toilets didn't really exist. But hey, at least you had the church, and roughly 8 weeks of holidays and festivals spread throughout the year. The truth is, life back then was difficult, but people got through it. They even managed to have a bit of fun while struggling to survive. Compare how they lived to your life today and see if you'd ever be able to trade places. Your typical day in a medieval town starts about 4 a.m. The church bell tolls, announcing the first mass of the day. But unless you're from a noble or royal house, you won't be going to church this morning. Instead, you'll be preparing your goods for sale at the market, which opens at 6. And there you'll stand for the next 9 hours, hoping you'll make enough to buy a chicken for dinner, instead of the same old cabbage and beans. Of course, not everyone in the Middle Ages was a peddler. The skill set in any given town could be quite diverse, with blacksmiths, tailors, masons, winemakers, and don't forget the tax collector. At around 3 in the afternoon, most retail businesses start shutting down for the day. And by 8 p.m., the city gates are closed and the night watchman takes up his post. Dinner at your house might not be very special, but up at the castle, the king is having a feast. All you can eat, all you can drink, and not a single dull moment. The fun doesn't stop with dinner. When the plates are cleared, the town's elite take to the dance floor. Even the knights. Don't feel left out. The commoners will get to have their fun at tomorrow's festival. But for now, rest up on that nice straw bed of yours. One of the good things about the Middle Ages, they did a lot of partying. It's estimated that in total, roughly 8 weeks of any given year were taken off for festivals or events. While a lot of these festivals were tied to the church, the town also hosted tournaments, which the church did not approve of. That's probably because tournaments made a spectacle of violence. From jousting to swordplay to making prisoners duel to the death. If you think that's cruel, it doesn't really get any better. Most serious crimes were settled by a trial by ordeal. For example, if you were accused of a crime, you might be subjected to a trial by water. Bound hand and foot, you'd be tossed into a body of water. If you sank, you'd be found innocent, because if you floated, it meant that you must have renounced baptism when entering the devil's service, and were therefore prevented from entering the water. While the physics of buoyancy wasn't exactly their strong suit, science did exist in the Middle Ages. For example, even in medieval times, the well-educated were well aware that the world was round. This period also saw the inventions of many items we still use today, such as the mechanical clock and the printing press. Too bad they didn't invent the toothbrush. In fact, if you were wealthy, it was fashionable to have rotting teeth, since it showed that you could afford sugar. Obesity was also a sign of prosperity, since it showed that you could afford meat and other luxury foods. But if the nobles lived well, the peasants were in the best health. Their well-balanced diet of bread and beans, paired with full days of physical labor, kept them in great shape. And as for their teeth, well, they didn't have toothpaste back then, so the common practice was to wash your mouth out with wine or vinegar after a meal. Not very hygienic, but that's not what the Middle Ages were about. You kept your hands and face clean to keep up appearances, but aside from the rich, no one really had toilets or bathtubs like we do today. This was a period of survival and salvation. And whatever people did to get by usually worked, at least until the 14th century. The last century of the medieval period truly put the dark in dark ages, as it was marred by famine, conflict, and plague. Also known as the Black Death, the plague wiped out as much as 60% of Europe's population in one of the most devastating pandemics in human history. And it took roughly 200 years for the world population to return to its previous level. But over the next few centuries, Europe underwent a renaissance, a time when people pursued truth and accuracy through skepticism and scrutinizing empirical evidence. This period initiated a scientific revolution that continues to this day. When you look back on it, the Middle Ages played an influential role in the development of modern society. But is it something we need to visit to see for ourselves? Or can we just trust the history books? I'd be willing to bet most of you would rather keep your interactions with medieval times to the restaurant chain rather than having to rinse your mouth out with vinegar after a meal.
All right, thanks so much for spending your time traveling with us today. We hope you enjoyed the trip and that you learned a thing or two in the end. But you should know that the adventures don't stop here. At What If, we're constantly exploring the unknown. Like, what if birds could teleport? Would they still bother flying south for the winter? Well, that sounds like a story for another What If.